Back in the early 1970s, practically every retail store of any size had a record department where 12-inch vinyl discs could be found in abundance. At the time, I enjoyed spending hours searching through the bins, always in search of some rare or unique item. On one such occasion, I came across an album of piano pieces written by an American composer named Scott Joplin. What piqued my curiosity, obvious from his picture on the album cover, was that he was black and was famous for his many brilliant ragtime piano compositions. I had never heard of this man, and furthermore, I hadn't the faintest idea what ragtime music was. So I bought the album, and later that same day I discovered the remarkable genius of Scott Joplin performed with appropriate ragtime flair by pianist Joshua Rifkin. Joplin's rise from abject post-Civil War poverty to prominence as a composer is recorded in The King of Ragtime, Edward Berlin's important biography. Joplin, he informs us, was born in or near Texarkana, Texas, in 1868. His father was an ex-slave and his mother was a freeborn black, and both had basic musical skills passed on to their 5 children. Joplin's natural aptitude for the piano was nurtured by a local teacher, and eventually he went on to study music at the George Smith College for Negroes. When published, Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag was his first major success, selling more than 1 million copies in print. A long list of ragtime compositions followed, earning him the title of the King of Ragtime. But for me, the biggest surprise was yet to come. Despite his fame as a composer of popular music, Joplin's greatest aspiration was to be recognized as a serious composer with ambitions to write an opera. As early as 1902-1903, Joplin made his first attempt to cross over into the exclusive white man's domain of grand opera with a work called A Guest of Honor. Joplin's manuscript has not survived, but Berlin speculates that the plot may have been based on a scandalous historical event of a black man, Booker T. Washington, honored at a private dinner in the White House with President Theodore Roosevelt. A few years later, in 1905, Joplin wrote the words and music for another opera in 3 acts, Premonitia, based on a purely original African-American theme. In 1911, he published a piano vocal score at his own expense, and in 1915 staged a single audition performance of the opera, accompanying the cast at the piano. No other production followed in his lifetime. Soon his physical and mental health declined, and he was committed to Manhattan State Hospital, where he died on April 1, 1917. Joplin was buried without ceremony at St. Michael's Cemetery in Brooklyn. Premonitia finally reached the stage in 1975 in a glitzy orchestration of Joplin's piano score by Gunther Schuller, mounted by the Houston Opera Company in 1975. From that production, we're going to listen to 2 excerpts from Premonitia that pretty much conclude the work, Antina Blow the Horn and The Real Slow Drag. The very idea of a black composer tackling such a formidable challenge as opera a half-century after the end of the American Civil War in an era of intense racial bigotry astonished me. I began at once to search out other black composers concurrent with Joplin with similar ambitions for the concert hall or the opera stage. But as it turned out, my search pushed me back much further back in time and much farther afield. For starters, I came across a fascinating character by the name of Joseph Boulange, Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Born around 1739, he was the son of a former French government official and a black woman from the island of Guadeloupe in the West Indies, where his father managed a plantation. In 1749, the three moved to Paris, where the boy received a good education and military experience. He quickly became an excellent horseman, an expert swordsman, and he also loved dancing, swimming, and skating. Little is known about his musical training, but he soon mastered the violin and began composing concertos and other large-scale works. He premiered his first violin concerto in 1772, a masterpiece by any standard. His fame throughout France as a violinist, composer, and conductor was such that he was often referred to as Le Mozart Noir, the Black Mozart. And he was quite the ladies' man, too. Between 1772 and 1779, more than 230 of his works were published, including many string quartets, violin concertos, various symphonic works, songs, and even a few operas. For several years, he served as captain in the French National Guard with a corps of approximately 1,000 black guardsmen under his command. Little is known of him thereafter, except that he died in Paris in June 1799. His colorful career was the subject of a Canadian television documentary. From that, we're going to hear a rondo from one of his violin concertos, the one in A major, Opus 5, number 2. Little is known about the life of Chevalier de Meude-Monpa, a contemporary of Joseph Boulogne. He was born in Paris of mixed African and European descent, studied music under several fine French teachers, served as a musketeer in the service of Louis XVI of France, and, quote, went into exile with the onset of the French Revolution. He composed and performed 6 violin concertos which were published in 1786 and rank in quality with those of the famous Mozart Noir. Our next composer takes us across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where José Mauricio Nunes Garcia was born in 1767, the son of a lieutenant and a black woman, Victoria Maria de la Cruz. Formerly educated with emphasis on his musical skills, he had affiliations with the important brotherhoods of St. Cecilia and of St. Peter in 1791. A year later, he was ordained a priest, and in 1798 was appointed the important position of Master of the Royal Chapel at the Cathedral in Rio. Multi-talented as an organist, conductor, composer, and a music teacher, Garcia's high position in the church required him to compose much liturgical music, including hymns and masses. As one writer said of him, being a mulatto did not seem to make a difference. With the arrival of new styles in music from Europe, Garcia's popularity waned. His music fell out of favor and his health began to deteriorate. He died in Rio on April 18, 1830, in extreme poverty, leaving a catalog of at least 300 compositions attributed to him. The Requiem Mass of 1816 is considered his masterpiece, which I recently found on an out-of-print CD. Francis Johnson was born in Martinique in the West Indies in 1792, but little is known about his musical training. He turns up in the historical record in America as a full-time musician playing bugle and violin with his very own band, popular in the black communities. Such was its excellence that Johnson's band gradually attracted the attention of white audiences, leading to tours around the U.S. and even to Europe. In 1824, he composed music to celebrate Revolutionary War hero General Lafayette's visit to Philadelphia. In 1838, Johnson and his band were in England and performed for Queen Victoria, who presented him with a silver bugle. In 1842, the Johnson Band provided music for a ball in honor of British author Charles Dickens on his American tour. Johnson also conducted works at church concerts, introducing the music of such composers as Haydn and Handel to black audiences. To Johnson's credit, he taught music to both black and white students at a school of black composers in Philadelphia. Racial abuses escalated about this time, and in 1843 the band members were attacked by a mob, severely beaten and stoned. Johnson's band dissolved, and he died a year later in Philadelphia. With the passage of years and changes in taste, his music disappeared, but he published works numbering over 300 numbers that survive in the archives. This work by Johnson is for Colonel George W. Ryder's Parade March and Quickstep. Years before the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, black composers thrived in the rich cultural mixture of New Orleans, and several prominent names emerged from that period, among them the remarkable Edmond Dédé. His parents were free Creoles of color from the West Indies who made their way to this city, where he was born on November 20th, 1827. Under the influence of his father, who had become bandmaster of the local militia, the boy proved to be a musical prodigy. Dédé eventually became close friends with Charles-Lucien Lambert, Sr., the conductor of the Philharmonic Society of New Orleans, a large ensemble composed mostly of free creoles of color. By 1852, he had established a reputation as the composer of romantic and sentimental tunes and popular hits of the time. But he still maintained his day job as a cigar maker. Dédé fulfilled his dream of going to Paris in 1857, where he kept company with such noted composers as Adolphe Adam, Jacques Halévy, and Charles Gounod. He conducted several orchestras abroad, settling for a time in Bordeaux, where he composed much music in various genres: dances, songs, string quartets, ballets, operettas, published for him in Paris. Dédé's music is generally light-hearted in spirit, evidenced by some of his titles: Chicago, the Grand American Waltz, and the Mephisto Polka Fantasy, reminiscent of his famous French contemporary and counterpart, Jacques Offenbach. Back in America for a time, he became profoundly disturbed by the mistreatment of blacks in post-Civil War America, and returned to France, where he was accorded many honors, and where he died in Paris in 1901. One of his selections is Mon Souffle Off. Sounds just like Jacques Offenbach, doesn't it? Well, surpassing even Edmond Dédé among black New Orleans composers were father and son Charles-Lucien Lambert Sr. and Lucien Léon Guillaume Lambert Jr. Charles Lucien's mother was a free Creole of color, and he was trained in music by his father. As a teenager, he was a friendly rival with a famous American virtuoso pianist and composer, Louis Moreau-Gottschalk, a favorite composer of mine. Charles Lucien was in Paris in 1854, where he concertized and composed music for the piano. Of his two published pieces, his Variations and Finale for piano on Clair de Lune had to be reprinted 5 times to meet sales demand. His son, Lucien Léon, was born near Paris in 1858. 2 years later, Charles Lucien moved the family to Rio de Janeiro, where he opened a music store and taught music. He became an honored member of the Brazilian National Institute of Music. Both son and father performed at one of Gottschalk's monster concerts with 31 pianists playing simultaneously. Lucien Léon's published music demonstrates that he was a superior talent to his father and left a much larger body of piano music, a ballet, symphonic pieces, a piano concerto, a work for organ and orchestra, and a requiem mass. Regrettably, some of his excellent compositions remain in manuscript awaiting future publication. So from Charles-Lucien Lambert, we hear the La Calabre Galop Brillant. According to the album notes on the CD, Blind Tom Wiggins, he was an eminent slave pianist-composer, the first in a long line of black musicians who were both canonized and exploited in life and marginalized and all but forgotten in death. Born Thomas Wiggins to enslaved parents in Columbus, Georgia in 1849, he was sold with them to General James Neal Bethune, a militant anti-abolitionist who advocated secession from the Union. Because Tom was blind from birth and deemed mentally impaired, he was thrown into the deal as mere chattel. It happened that Tom, a little child at the time, heard the general's daughter playing the piano in the parlor and, approaching the keyboard, immediately began to repeat the tune. The general sensed an opportunity to exploit Tom's astonishing talent and began formal piano lessons. When Tom was 8, the general toured him around Georgia as a freak show attraction because he could play music backwards, sing one song while playing a second and third at the same time with the right and left hands, repeat whole speeches heard from memory, even in original foreign languages. 2 years later, the general hired him out to an impresario for $15,000. President James Buchanan invited him to perform at the White House, and he was a sensation on a European tour. Tom's annual income of around $100,000 was pocketed by the general, claiming he was Tom's keeper, even after emancipation. In 1888, Tom was allowed to retire, but the money from sales of his published music, transcribed by others from his actual performances, and occasional concerts went to his guardians. Tom died of a stroke on June 13, 1908, in his apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, and was buried in an unmarked grave. His piano compositions include polkas, galops, improvisations, and the ever-popular crowd-pleasing novelty pieces. One such novelty piece we will hear a portion of is the Battle of Manassas. Be prepared for some unusual sounds from the keyboard and some oral sounds that Tom Wiggins would also produce. and then a brief galop to show a difference of his style. Samuel Coleridge Taylor was born in London in August 1875. His father was a doctor from Sierra Leone who came to England and married an English white woman. Impulsively, the doctor decided to return to Africa, abandoning his wife and their young son. Samuel's mother eventually remarried, and the boy became the only black member of an all-white family. He grew up in Croydon, studied violin and singing, and at 15 he entered the Royal College of Music as a violin student. At this age, he composed a large-scale choral Te Deum, and several of his anthems were published by the time he was 16. In 1892, he earned a scholarship, and several of his chamber works and a part of a symphony attracted favorable public attention, meriting a composition prize in 1895-96. The famous composer Sir Edward Elgar, who had become a good friend, recommended Coleridge Taylor to his own publisher. Around this time, he composed his most famous work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, a cantata for soloists, chorus, and orchestra, based on a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which became very popular both in England and in the United States. His Hiawatha cantata on an American Indian theme was a means of connecting him to his own Negro identity. When performed at the Birmingham Festival in 1900, the composer was honored with a standing ovation. The printed score of Hiawatha became a bestseller at 140,000 copies before World War I. Coleridge Taylor also excelled as a conductor, earning him the nickname of the Black Mahler, associating him with a highly respected German composer. He conducted the Handel Society from 1904 until his death, serving also as a teacher of composition at Trinity College of Music, London. Coleridge Taylor had many admirers in the U.S. and paid visits here in 1904, 1906, and 1910 at the invitation of the newly formed Coleridge Taylor Society in Washington, D.C., which served the interests of black singers. It was said of him that his mission in life was to help establish the dignity of the black man. It comes as no surprise, then, that among other influences on his music included the American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, the Fisk Jubilee Singers of Nashville, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington. Negro musical ideas permeate many of Coleridge Taylor's nearly 100 compositions, including operatic, choral, orchestral, chamber, piano, and sacred pieces. He once remarked that he had to decide whether to, quote, to write music that sounded African or to prove that he could write music that did not. The Violin Concerto was his last work, first performed in Old Connecticut on June 4, 1912. Hardly 3 months later, Coleridge Taylor died in Croydon on September 1, 1912, of pneumonia, reportedly from a heavy self-imposed work schedule. We're going to hear a selection from the Hiawatha Cantata. We penetrate more directly into the modern era with William Grant Still, born in Woodville, Mississippi on May 11, 1895. After his father, the town bandmaster, died, the family moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, where he commenced studies in medicine. But his interest in the violin drew him to the field of music. For a time, he performed with the W.C. Handy Ensemble in 1916, then entered the Oberlin Conservatory here in Ohio to study composition. After a period of service in the United States Navy during the First World War, Still wound up in New York City working with Handy's publishing company and playing oboe part-time in a theater orchestra. American composer George W. Chadwick offered Still a scholarship, urging him to write American music. His first major large-scale work was the Afro-American Symphony, premiered in 1931 by the Rochester Philharmonic, the first symphony by a black composer to be played by a leading orchestra. Grove's dictionary states that Still was the first black to conduct a major American orchestra, the first to have an opera performed by an important company, the first to write for radio, films, and television. He was the recipient of many awards and honors, including doctorates from Harvard, Oberlin, Bates, the University of Arkansas, and prizes from CBS, the New York World's Fair of 1939, the League of Composers, and other leading orchestras. Still is best known for his American works based on Negro and folk idioms, and is the most recorded of black composers, with 7 operas, 5 symphonies, including the aforementioned Afro-American Symphony No. 1, Song of a New Race, Symphony No. 2, the Sunday Symphony No. 3, Autochthonous No. 4, and the Western Hemisphere No. 5, and of course the African Symphonic Poem. Still has courageously explored the darker aspect of the African-American experience in America with And They Lynched Him on a Tree for chorus. From his work, we're going to listen to the third movement of the Afro-American Symphony, Animato. Years later, Judith Still, the daughter of Still and his wife Arvie, said that the New York Critics intentionally panned Still's troubled island opera due to racism. Howard Taubman, a critic and friend of Still, came to my father and said, "Billy, because I'm your friend, I think I should tell you this. The critics have had a meeting to decide what to do about your opera. They think The Colored Boy has gone far enough, and they have voted to pan your opera." And that was it. In those days, critics had that kind of influence. William Levi Dawson is a name well known to choral singers, since he made many idiomatic settings of spirituals, making full use of the human voice. The CD album notes go on to tell us that after graduating from the Tuskegee Institute in 1921, Dawson entered Washington College in Topeka, Kansas, and the Horner Institute of Fine Arts in Kansas City. In 1927, he received his M.A. in composition at the American Conservatory of Music in Chicago. Eventually, he returned to Tuskegee to teach and spent much of his life dedicated to the choir of Tuskegee Institute, where he founded the School of Music. Dawson began to compose his Negro Folk Symphony while in Chicago and showed his work to Leopold Stokowski, who suggested he expand it. This longer version was accepted by the noted conductor who first performed it with the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1934 to a very appreciative audience. After a trip to Africa in 1952, Dawson made further revisions to the symphony in order to embody authentic African rhythm patterns. It is this version that has been recorded and performed today, and I understand that a new recording has just been released. The work is based entirely on Negro folk music, especially spirituals. James P. Johnson was born in New Brunswick, New Jersey in 1894 and lived most of his life in New York City. He was the most important black musician in New York during the decade of the 1920s, first cutting piano rolls for player pianos and then recording piano solos on disc. He is best known as the father of stride piano, which evolved from ragtime and has become all the rage in Harlem, the first true jazz piano idiom. His work went on to influence many jazz musicians like Fats Waller, Jelly Roll Morton, Willie the Lion Smith, Eubie Blake, and Duke Ellington. Singers Bessie Smith and Ethel Waters considered him their favorite accompanist. As a composer, he scored all or part of around 16 musical reviews in the 1920s. From 1923, he produced Runnin' Wild with its famous number, The Charleston. Johnson most wanted to be remembered as a serious composer of symphonic music using African-American idioms. With his family in Jamaica, Long Island, he studied all aspects of music composition in order to tell the story of America's ethnic heritage, especially of his own race. His efforts to get his music performed after the 1940s proved fruitless. Still, he wrote 2 symphonies, a piano and a clarinet concerto, 2 ballets, 2 one-act operas, etc. Victory Stride was recorded in 1944, his Harlem Symphony in 1932, 4 parts, Subway Journey, April in Harlem, Nightclub, and Baptist Mission. Yamacraw, the Negro Rhapsody, was composed for solo piano in 1927, shortly thereafter arranged for piano and orchestra by William Grant Still, and performed at Carnegie Hall in 1928 with W.C. Handy conducting and Fats Waller at the piano. What a concert that must have been. In semi-retirement, Johnson concentrated on symphonic compositions. He died in Jamaica, New York City, in November 1955. Here's a bit of his Victory Stride. Edward Kennedy, Duke Ellington, was born in Washington, D.C., April 29, 1899. Duke's father was a butler in the White House and wanted his son to become an artist. Duke began to study the piano at the age of 7, influenced largely by ragtime pianists. Thanks to his mother, Duke was well-mannered, especially around dignified women, lived and dressed elegantly. His friends began calling him Duke, claiming that he had the bearing of a young nobleman. At 17, he made his professional debut with his own band in Washington, then moved to New York on the advice of Fats Waller. In the years thereafter, Duke and his band performed at New York's Kentucky Club, then on to the Cotton Club in Harlem, emerging as one of the leaders in the world of jazz. His band had grown from 5 to 19 members, releasing over 200 records in his early jungle style. Duke took his band to Hollywood in 1930 for the film Check and Double Check. His big hit in 1930 was Mood Indigo, confirming his fame and reputation. But Duke now was anxious to experiment with larger compositions, the first being Reminiscence in Tempo, followed by the Creole Rhapsody, creating interesting challenges for the band. After completing major tours in the U.S. and Europe across a span of 10 years from 1932 to 1942, Duke and his band presented an annual concert at Carnegie Hall across another decade. The first success was with the monumental Black, Brown, and Beige, depicting the history of black people in the U.S. through their music. Other multi-movement suites followed, defying the standard model of jazz music. For the first time, he was invited to write a film score in 1959 for Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder. In the last decade of his life, Duke wrote liturgical music, including In the Beginning God for orchestra, chorus, soloists, and dancers. Premiered in San Francisco's Grace Cathedral in 1965. He was the recipient of many awards and honors, honorary doctorate at Howard University in 1963, Yale 1967, the President's Medal of Honor in 1969, and in 1970 he was named member of the Royal Music Academy of Stockholm. His son Mercer took over the band after Ellington's death on May 24, 1974, in New York City. Duke Ellington is considered by many to be the most important composer in jazz history. An estimated list of his compositions hovers around 6,000 titles, many of them 3-minute pieces for older 78 RPM discs. 50 film scores, several suites, including Harlem, The River, and one opera, Bula. From the River Suite, we're going to hear the Gurgling Rapids. The historic record reveals a surprising number of African American women who established formidable reputations as composers of large-scale musical compositions, prominent among them Florence Beatrice Price. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas on April 9, 1887, to a mixed-race couple, Price had her first music lessons from her mother, a music teacher. At 4, she gave a performance at the piano, and at 11, her first piano piece was published. Price eventually attended the New England Conservatory of Music, where she composed her first symphony and graduated with honors. In 1910, she became head of the music department at Clark Atlanta University in Georgia, and 2 years later married attorney Thomas Price. They returned to Little Rock, Arkansas, and began a family. A racist climate here motivated the Prices to move to Chicago in 1927, where Florence had opportunities to study at various institutions, including the University of Chicago and the American Conservatory of Music. Divorced in 1931, she assumed the care of 2 daughters, but made valuable friendships with author Langston Hughes and soprano Marian Anderson. Within a year, Price won the first and third prizes of the Wanamaker Foundation Awards for her Symphony in E minor and the Piano Sonata. The symphony was premiered by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra on June 15, 1933, the first composition by an African-American woman to be performed by a major orchestra. Price's impressive body of compositions covers almost every means of musical expression, from songs for voice and piano to full orchestral symphonies and choral works, many incorporating traditional black melodies and rhythms, words from the notes to one of her recent albums. In 1940, Florence Beatrice Price became a member of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. On June 3, 1953, she died of a stroke in Chicago and was buried in Holy Sepulchre Cemetery, Alsip, Cook County, Illinois. We're going to listen to an excerpt from her Symphony No. 1, the Juba Dance. For a footnote on Florence Beatrice Price, let's jump ahead about 65 years to an article which appeared in the New Yorker on February 5th, 2018. It reads, in 2009, Vicki and Daryl Gatwood of St. Anne, Illinois, were preparing to renovate an abandoned house on the outskirts of a town. The structure was in poor condition. Vandals had ransacked it, and a fallen tree had torn a hole in the roof. In a part of the house that had remained dry, the Gatwoods made a curious discovery: piles of musical manuscripts, books, personal papers, and other documents. The name that kept appearing in the materials was that of Florence Price. The Gatwoods looked her up on the internet and found that she was a moderately well-known composer based in Chicago who had died in 1953. The dilapidated house had once been her summer home. She was self-described as having two strokes against her. One was being a woman, the other having Negro blood in her veins. So to bring our survey of black composers, I've chosen one modern composer, just came to my attention very recently. This is the talent bringing us into the 21st century, Adolphus Hilstork. Hilstork earned his B.A. degree in composition at Howard University in 1963, and then spent the summer studying with the famous Nadia Boulanger at the American Conservatory in Fontainebleau. Back in the U.S., he continued his studies at the Manhattan School, where he obtained a second B.A. in 1965 and his M.A. in 1966. Following 2 years in the Army stationed in West Germany, he completed a Ph.D. at Michigan State University in 1971. His first teaching job was right here in Ohio at Youngstown State University from 1971 to 1977, and then he settled for a long tenure at Norfolk State College in Virginia. He first gained attention back in 1966 when the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra performed his master's thesis, Statements, Variations, and Fugue. His works have since been performed by various orchestras, the Chicago Symphony prominent among them, but so far little of his music has been picked up by the publishing houses, and yet he's been recognized through important commissions, such as his piano concerto in 1990 from a consortium of orchestras, and his opera, Paul Laurence Dunbar, Common Ground, premiered by the Dayton, Ohio Opera Company in 1995. Concerning Hilstork's style, he says, my source is postmodern in the sense that it is eclectic, does not cling to older fashions, and he emphasizes that his music always sings. He admits a large debt to the influences of composers he embraced in his formative years, Aaron Copland, Samuel Barber, and Igor Stravinsky. He has felt free but not compelled to work African-American idioms into some of his music, mostly through colorful instrumentation or jazz ensembles, which frequently alludes to figures and events in African-American history. He's composed music for a variety of instrumental and vocal combinations, up to works for full orchestra and, thus far, one opera. And I have noted that a number of new recordings of music by Adolphus Hilstork have now appeared. So let's listen to the Hilstork Symphony No. 2, the final Allegro. Well, ending this survey by way of an apology, I must admit that my collection of black composers and African American composers was based, for the most part, on the CDs I found in my personal collection. There are many others who merit consideration, since the presence of African American talents in the contemporary world hold prominent places in all forms of dance, as composers of concert and chamber works, opera, and film soundtracks. There are as well performers who are virtuosos at the keyboard or the violin, or opera singers, and others still who dominate the conductor's podium in front of some of the most prominent orchestras in the world. February concert schedules that include jazz and gospel, and Gershwin would be providing an important service by including at least one or two works by such notables as any of those listed above. Some other African American composers of our own era known to me through the recordings include Undine Smith Moore, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, Joseph Jennings, Bill Banfield, Evelyn Simpson Currington, Billy Childs, David Baker. It's got quite a long list that is made available. Look them up on the internet at the important Africlassical site, and you'll see quite a long list of names. So let's begin exploring and getting more of these names, old and new, on the concert program.